Today on One Wild World, we're sniffing out an extraordinary story with Marlee Monahan, a trailblazer who partners with four-legged detectives in the lush landscapes of Hawaii. Marlee isn't your average canine handler. She's on the front lines of an ecological battle, part of the coconut rhinoceros beetle response team at the University of Hawaii, where the stakes are as high as the canopies. In this episode, we dig into the gritty details of the canine detection program, the fight against invasive species that threaten Hawaii's ecological paradise, and what it means to clock in every day knowing your colleague has more fur than you do. Marlee's world is one where collaboration between human and hound is critical, not just for the detection of invasive pests, but for preserving the natural beauty of an island state that's no stranger to ecological challenges. It's a job that's as unconventional as it is vital, filled with challenges, victories, and an unparalleled bond between a handler and her canine partner. Prepare for a journey into the heart of Hawaii's ecological defense, where Marlee Monahan and her four-legged partners are standing guard. This is a story of partnership, protection, and the power of a good snout. This is One Wild World. Marlee, welcome. Thanks for being on the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
That is quite a title, and so I'm hoping we can break that apart piecewise. So let's start with what it means to be a USDA certified detection dog handler.
So the USDA, which is a federal agency, has a detection dog program based out of Atlanta, Georgia. They have a whole training center called the National Detector Dog Training Center. And through this center, they train dogs for all sorts of detection jobs within agriculture and conservation. So when you go to the airport and you see dogs maybe searching for produce, or sometimes there are dogs in mail facilities that are looking for produce or other kinds of animals, things they don't want being shipped to sensitive places. They train dogs for more conservation-based work like invasive snail species, or they have some programs involved with the eradication of nutria in the Northeast. But all of those dogs and handlers are trained through this program and then are sent out to their various field projects. So I was trained by the USDA, went through a certification program to become a detection dog handler, to work with a canine partner who is trained to sniff out a very specific invasive species.
And that invasive species is the coconut rhinoceros beetle. Can you tell us a little bit more about that beetle and then why they need to be detected in the first place in Hawaii?
So the coconut rhinoceros beetle, which I might also call CRB just because it's a bit of a mouthful, is a scarab beetle. They're really large. The adults can be 2 to 3 inches large. They're all black. They've got a big long horn, pretty common with rhinoceros beetles. They are originally native to Southeast Asia as well as some parts of Africa and China, but they have since spread to other parts of the Pacific, including Samoa, Guam, and Hawaii, which once they're introduced to these new places where they did not evolve, they have the capacity to be really damaging. So in Hawaii specifically, as their name implies, one of their main target species is going to be the coconut palms. And they like to feed on the nice juicy spears as the fresh fronds are emerging from the tree. They actually bore into it. They make these big holes in there that are about 2 inches wide, and they will damage the fronds. The fronds come out looking all chopped up. And over time, with enough repetitive damage, it can kill the tree. It can open the tree up to more diseases or just generally stress the tree to where they stop producing fruit. And then as we've been seeing their numbers increase, they've proven to be very good at generalizing as well. So we've seen them cause damage on lolu, which is the native Hawaiian fan palm, as well as hala, which is another native species, in addition to other tropical crops like bananas. So that makes them a really big concern, both for those cultural and those agricultural resources, which in a place like Hawaii, or even on other small islands like Samoa and Guam, those natural resources are finite and very important. And so trying to keep that under control is a big concern, especially because they can be so widely damaging.
Absolutely. I think it's one of the things that's really hard to keep up on is these species that are invasive are often generalists. So they're able to adapt to whatever gets thrown at them. And in the case where there's not a lot of environmental pressures on them, they can just flourish, which means a lot of damage to the ecosystems. So I want to quickly back things up a second and talk about how did you first find your passion for animals? And then how did that lead you to working with detection dogs?
It was definitely a very non-linear path that I took to get to where I am right now. I grew up always really enjoying animals. And when you're a young kid, especially in the 90s, it was like your options were veterinarian or marine biologist. And by marine biologist, most of us thought about working at SeaWorld, not doing actual research. And so it wasn't until I was a little bit older that I realized that working with animals didn't only have to be in those capacities, that there was the option to work with wild animals in wildlife rehab, wildlife management, wildlife research. And when it came time to go to college, I ended up getting a degree actually in forestry from Northern Arizona University with an emphasis on wildlife management and ecology. And I did a lot of entomology work right out of school, eventually transitioned into endangered bird management and did a lot of seasonal field jobs over the years. And early on in that process, I had learned about detection dogs. I had just seen a job posting for it. I applied for it. I had no experience. I obviously did not get it. But from that moment on, it was in the back of my mind. And as I went through these field jobs, seasonal contract work that I would do, I feel like in most of them, I was able to identify some part of that job that would have been so much easier if we just had dogs to assist us. And looking back on that, whether or not those would be feasible uses for dogs in the field setting is debatable, but it was always just in the back of my mind. And obviously, it's a very niche position to have. There's not a lot of organizations who do this work, especially in the US. So jobs are few and far between. And I just got very lucky with towards the end of 2020, I was looking for work and I just happened to see a job posting for this specific program. And I applied and got it and moved to Hawaii specifically for this job. I had some experience working with dogs and cats in the past. I'd work in shelter environments and groomers and things like that, but I'd never done a whole lot of training or detection work. I had never done scent detection before. And the USDA was able to provide all of that specific training where I was able to merge it with all of my field experience. And then I've been learning every day since, and that's been for about 2.5 years that I've been doing this.
You said that the USDA helped make sure that you were trained and ready to be one of these detection dog handlers. What did your training look like, or how long did that take for people that are interested?
Typically, the training courses through the National Detector Dog Training Center, I believe, are like 12 to 13 weeks. Mine was only about 8 because they actually fly the instructors to Hawaii to train us rather than us going to the center in Georgia. So they condense it a little bit. Basically, the process is going to be getting paired with a dog. Usually they'll test you out on multiple dogs to try to find the best fit between the dog and the handler, because that relationship is the most important thing in this kind of work. You need to have a good relationship with the dog. You need to work well with them. Once they've got you paired with the dog that you're going to work with, they go through instruction on basic obedience training, leash handling, first aid, things like that, everything that is required to keep you and the dog safe in the field, as well as how to do the actual scent detection work. Because the job as the handler isn't necessarily to train the dog. The dog comes to us already trained, at least with all the basics. We still do a lot of maintenance training. That is still part of my job, but I did not do scent imprinting or training of the dog at the start of the program. So my job as a handler is to do everything in my power to set them up for success and to be able to read their body language, understand what they're doing, understand what the odor is doing, and to follow up on any leads that the dog is giving me, and to read that body language and communicate with the dog so that we are most likely to be successful in the field. So a lot of our training was just learning how to do that, learning how to deal with obstacles in sourcing odor, to learn how the dogs work in the field and how to troubleshoot any of those issues that you come across when you're out in the field working.
Yeah, I think one thing that really just intrigues me about this position that you have is that they're not treated as pets. They're more treated like coworkers. So you have to be able to read the dog and pick up the signs that it's showing you, and vice versa. It has to be able to trust you to be able to lead it to the correct areas. And I think that's something that people have as a misconception, is that a lot of times they see these dogs as pets for you.
Yeah, it's very much a team, and that's what they call us, a canine team, right? So one couldn't do it without the other. We have to, like I said, the communication goes both ways. And with the dogs in the field, we can't force them to do this work, right? We teach them that doing certain behaviors will earn them a reward that they value, and it's up to them to do the work. So dogs are sentient beings. They are just like us. They have off days, they have bad days. They have days where they're excited to go to work and days where they aren't. And the best I can do is work with what my canine partner is giving me so that we can get things done and, like I said, still be successful even if the search area is very difficult or he's just not very focused that day. It's up to me to sort of accommodate that and then do what we can to get the job done.
You talked a little bit there about the rewards for the dogs. And so I'm curious, what do you use as rewards?
We primarily use food reward. That's part of the USDA training, is they prefer food motivated dogs. But a lot of other organizations that do this work will also look for toy motivated dogs. So dogs who love to play fetch or frisbee, who will do anything for a tennis ball. For us, we have dogs that are highly food motivated. We provide them with very, very good quality treats that they're willing to do the work for. So we have 3 dogs in our program. We have 2 lab mixes, and one is a Pointer Vizsla mix, and they're all very food motivated and will do just about anything to get that treat.
I was curious also if there are breeds of dogs that work best for detecting things, or if it's something that dogs across the board can be taught to do this.
The breed itself doesn't really matter. 2 of our dogs were actually found in shelters. They're just mixed breeds. And you'll find that a lot of dogs that do this work actually come from shelter backgrounds, because dogs that continually get returned to the shelter because they're too much for a normal family to handle, if you give them a job, they become happy, fulfilled, and great working dogs. So the breed itself doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is if the dog is sufficiently motivated. So if they have that high food or toy drive, which not every dog is willing to work that hard for a treat, and that's not going to be a dog that's going to work very hard in the field. Also, as long as they are appropriately sized or physically capable for the work you're asking of them. So we're doing a lot of work where we are on farms and in nursery centers or things like that, sort of semi-urban environments where we are actually searching through big piles of mulch and potted plants and things like that. Because although the CRB feed on the coconut palms, they breed in decomposing green waste. And that's why they're so hard to find, because they're in these big piles of decomposing plant material. So we wouldn't necessarily want a small little dog that we would be asking to traverse these big piles of mulch and green waste. We want something a little bigger. So all of our dogs are about 50 to 60 pounds. Likewise, the dogs that are working in the airport or in the mail centers for the agriculture, a lot of those you'll see are Jack Russells or Beagles, something they're a little bit smaller. They're easy to lift up onto pallets or crates or onto conveyor belts. They're a little less intimidating for people who might see them in the airport. So those are all things that you need to consider. But ultimately, any dog that's sufficiently motivated can be trained to do scent work. It's actually a very enriching thing for dogs to do, even if there's not a specific job that they're doing. If you can just teach them to do scent work, that can be very fun for most dogs.
I always let people know that when they're training dogs, you can't just expect them to do exactly what you want that first time. And you have to slowly increase the difficulty and the complexity of what you're asking for until you, at the end, have the trick or the behavior that you want. And so I'm curious, when you were working with these dogs, how do you gradually increase the difficulty or the complexity of that training until it's matching what you're wanting to find these beetles?
That's a great point. That is exactly how the process works. And honestly, when I came into this from a field technician background where I was doing a lot of data collection for research projects, I was worried that this job not being quite as science-based and being more management-based might not be as interesting to me. But I found that behavioral science side of things was very interesting, and it involves a lot of problem solving and a lot of this same process that you just described of slowly increasing the difficulty, and when things aren't working the way that you want them to work, to fix that. An example of that might be that when you're first training the dog on odor, you might have a container with a high concentration of larvae. So there's just a lot of odor available. And you might just have that with maybe 2 other containers that are empty, and then you reward them when they smell the one with the target. As they get better, then you start doing things with targets buried in mulch and green waste. First, you might start only 1 inch buried until they can find that. And when they prove they can reliably locate that target at a 1 inch depth, then we might slowly start burying it deeper and deeper, or we might start doing less and less larvae in the container so that there's less odor available. And again, if at any point in this process they're showing signs that they're having difficulties, then we just look at where we went wrong and then take a step back and work our way back up again. And it's that sort of troubleshooting and problem solving that we have to look at every day in the field as we encounter new variables and new challenges.
Do you have any tips or tricks for listeners that are just trying to train their house dog? Maybe not to smell for invasive beetles, but to perform a trick. Do you have any insight into that world, having worked with dogs in that capacity?
I think an important thing to think about is, again, taking small steps, like I just described, right? I think a lot of people want quick results, or they think that if they just do one simple thing, the dog will automatically get it. And that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times it takes a lot of baby steps. And if you can do that and build your dog's confidence at each and every step, then that behavior is going to be trained much more solidly. And so I think a lot of people get frustrated and they get impatient, and they're not necessarily willing to take a step back to where we lost things and then work our way up, or even to just try different things, because every dog is different, every trainer is different. And so understanding that what worked for one dog might not work for another dog, and just being open-minded and willing to try new things will be beneficial usually.
Okay, so bringing things back, I know we mentioned that they're not pets, and then we ended up talking about like people's pets. When the dogs aren't working, where do they stay? Do they stay with you full time, or is there a facility that they're at?
Yeah, so they stay in a kennel, which is something that is required of all federal detection dogs. They have specific standards for the care and safety of all of the dogs. The kennel they stay at meets all of these requirements. It's fully staffed. So in the morning, I will go pick up my main working dog. So my main partner, his name is Ryder. I pick him up and we go out for the day. We go do our surveys. In the afternoon, we might do some physical conditioning, or if he needs any grooming or other care, I take care of that as well. And then at the end of the day, I drop him back off at the kennel where he is taken care of overnight. I know a lot of private organizations that do this. They have their dogs that live with them, or they have dogs that maybe start out as pets that they train to do this. But then through the USDA and through the federal realm, it's a little bit of a different process.
I'm curious what a day out in the field looks like. So you had mentioned that a lot of times these beetles are in these big green waste piles or mulch. When the dog detects the beetle or the larva, how do they let you know that they found something?
The way the process actually works, we arrive to a location, whether that, like I said, is a nursery, or sometimes it's the military base or a neighborhood. And when we have material that could potentially be a breeding site for CRB, we will usually go through and we actually aerate it a little bit. So we will use tools to sort of churn up some spots along the outside of the pile, just because when that mulch has been sitting there, especially if it's wet, any odor can get really trapped inside. And we don't have any conclusive data on this, but just anecdotally, we've noticed the dogs do much better if you create some new channels for airflow to bring the odor out to the surface more efficiently. We'll usually go around, we'll prepare the pile just by poking some holes in it, essentially. And then when we have the dogs out on leash, which they're always leashed in this case, we tell them to find it. They get to sniffing. The whole time, I'm going to be looking for any indication that he might be on odor. So we look for what we call changes of behavior. And that might be a quick head turn or a sudden direction change. Sometimes they close their mouth, so they sniff much more intently and they get very focused. Their ears might perk up and you might start seeing a tail wag because they get excited. If they smell the target odor, they associate that with their treat, so they start showing some signs of excitement. If they do smell the CRB, they are trained to respond by sitting. If he sits in the middle of a search and then usually he'll point with his nose, that's his indication to me that he thinks there's something there. And again, that trained response is going to be different for every program. A lot of people like to go into whatever the dog naturally wants to do. Sometimes it's a bark, sometimes it's a lay down, sometimes it's a scratching, but it's just going to depend on the program. So at that point, once he sits to indicate that he smells CRB, we have our field crew come in and start digging and taking the mulch apart to try to verify the presence of the insects. And that's one of the things that's very tricky about this particular project, is that we don't always have an instant reward, which can be very important for training that response and that behavior, is that you get rewarded instantly for it. But because these are buried sometimes 2-3 feet down, it might take us a minute to dig through and verify that the beetles are there before we reward the dog. Once we get that verification, we can reward the dog. He gets his treat. And when we're in the field and we find something like that, he usually gets what we call a jackpot reward. So it's just like the best day ever. We get very excited. We hype him up. He gets the best possible treat he could get. And then after that, it's out of our hands. The field crew takes care of removing what larvae they can find, and we pass on management recommendations to the landowner about what to do with the material, how to remove it safely, or how to treat it.
And I know that coconut rhinoceros beetles were first discovered on Oahu in, I think it was late 2013. Do you have an estimate of their current population in Hawaii?
I don't have a specific number. At this point, they're pretty widespread through most of the island of Oahu. At this point, Oahu is where they are primarily concentrated. It was only as of about 2 months ago, actually, that we had our first detection on an island other than Oahu, and we had a couple of beetles caught near the airport on Kauai. We are following up on that. We haven't gone out there with the dogs yet, but our field team has been trying to get a feel for what the situation is like out there. But our primary concern on Oahu is controlling them and containing them to the island and not letting them get off to the other Hawaiian islands or to the U.S. mainland.
And I imagine also that's probably fairly hard to estimate just because they are invasive. And like we said, they're generalists. So when they find an area that they're able to thrive, they thrive.
Yeah, and they can lay very large clutches of eggs, and there have been times where we have found a breeding site in a pile of mulch and we pull out 300 larvae. The main way we use to monitor their population changes are with a pheromone lure trap. So there are about 3,000 of these traps on the island of Oahu, and we use the catches in those traps to sort of indicate where the hot spots are, and then those inform our activities as far as where we take the dogs to search. If there was a trap that normally didn't catch any CRB and all of a sudden it started catching more frequently, that would be an indication to us that there might be new breeding activity nearby. Maybe somebody moved some infested mulch without realizing it, and now they've been spread to this new spot. And that's when we will go out with the dogs to try to find where that might be coming from so that we can then remove it before it gets too entrenched in that new area.
So is that kind of what's happening now on Kauai, is the use of those pheromone detectors? And then later on, if it's more pervasive, is that when you and the dogs will go out there?
The pheromone lure traps aren't a reliable way of controlling the population. They are only effective for monitoring trends. They just don't catch enough to really make a dent, unfortunately. So at this point, we're still very much in an evaluation stage. People are being sent out there pretty often at this point where they are putting up more traps. They're training people who live out there how to check the traps and monitor for breeding sites, things like that. But at this point, we don't really know to what extent they've established themselves out there yet. And if it gets to the point where we start seeing breeding activity or a significant increase in trap catches, then they might be sending the dogs out there. But this is very new territory for us, so we have to work up a whole plan for how we fly the dogs over, where do they stay. Resources out there can be a little more limited than on Oahu. So we have to get all of that in order before we have an opportunity to send them over.
I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest threat to wildlife in 2024?
That's a really tough one. It could be any number of things. If I was to be general about it, I think invasive species do have a huge impact on native wildlife, and they pose a huge threat. Out here, the big ones that we see, we actually have seen a huge decline in native Hawaiian forest birds due to diseases carried by non-native mosquitoes. So there is a lot of work happening now trying to get that under control before any more native species go extinct. And then the other big one is going to be feral cats, or even just free roaming cats, which I know is a very controversial topic, but especially here in Hawaii, we have a lot of free roaming cats that are harming not only native birds, but have even been shown to harm the native Hawaiian monk seals through diseases and things like that. So those definitely pose a big risk. And I think it's one of those things that doesn't receive quite as much support as it probably needs to be controlled properly.
Yeah, I was excited to talk with you about invasive species. I feel like a lot of times we hear about habitat degradation and pollution, but invasive species are a huge part of that. And especially when you're looking at a whole ecosystem level, introducing new species to that ecosystem can really change the way that it functions. So I'm curious also, what do you think needs to be studied more in the future with canine detection? If you were able to advance research in one area, what would you choose?
Ooh. I think there's a lot of potential uses for it. There's a lot of people doing a lot of really interesting data collection using dogs for wildlife research. There are people who use dogs to find bumblebee nests or find whale scat for DNA sampling, getting information on very elusive carnivores, again, by finding scat that they can take DNA samples from. And I think that there's still a lot of potential there when it comes to using dogs to find endangered species, data on that, as well as additional uses for invasive species. And that includes plants, that includes diseases, that includes insects and other types of wildlife. I think there is just limitless potential for how dogs could be helpful in the field, especially in difficult situations like we have with CRB, where their breeding sites are very well hidden and difficult to find. They definitely give us a leg up when it comes to trying to control those things.
And then what advice would you give to people who are curious about working with animals and wildlife, or even getting into this field?
I think one of the biggest things is to remain open-minded. I didn't come into this thinking that my life goal was to work with conservation dogs. I didn't even know that was a thing. And even when it comes to entomology, I just happened to take a class in college and really enjoyed it and was surprised that I enjoyed it. And that opened up so many more doors that I never would have expected were even options. And so I think this kind of career path can take you into a lot of different places. And just because you select one path initially doesn't mean you have to stay on that. You can try a lot of different things in the general field of conservation or research and still bounce around a little bit without having to pigeonhole yourself in one specific thing.
Finally, I always love to ask this question towards the end. How can people best support you or the work that you do or the work with CRB?
So that one's a little bit tricky unless you live in Hawaii already, because if you live in Hawaii, the best thing you can do is to utilize responsible green waste management practices and report CRB when you find them. That said, a lot of people obviously visit Hawaii and want to visit Hawaii. It's a very big tourist destination. Hawaii has a very complicated relationship with tourism, because when you have that volume of visitors coming through a place, it's going to have major impacts on the environment and on the community. I would say if you were planning at some point in your life to visit, to maybe do some research ahead of time, educate yourself so that your visit can be conscious and respectful and responsible. And that can look like anything. If you're planning on taking a hike somewhere, learning how to properly decontaminate your gear so that you don't inadvertently spread fungal pathogens like rapidohea death, or maybe using reef-safe sunscreen when you're going in the ocean so that you're not contributing to the decline of marine life. And that's definitely something that personal responsibility when you visit such a sensitive ecosystem, strained daily by just the sheer number of people utilizing it, that can definitely make a difference. And even beyond that, once you're home or wherever you're at now, I think it can be really important to look into invasive species and the threats in your own area, and looking into what you can do to prevent the further establishment of those species or even actively help to remove them. Because most places you go, there's going to be something that is struggling due to an invasive species, and there's something you can learn about your own community there.
Yeah. Unfortunately, invasive species are all over the world. And so looking at those tiny little things that you can do to just help out are definitely vital things that we can do in our everyday life. Marlee, thanks so much for being on the podcast today, sharing about the work that you do with detection dogs. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Nice chat with you about invasive species.
If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe. And to find out more about the work we do to support animals, visit our website at theechofilm.com. Follow us on Instagram at theechoanimals, and follow our TikTok at creature.feature. On behalf of all creatures, big and small, thank you for listening.